All right, so now we're ready to graph sine and cosine graphs by hand. So when we do this, the first thing we're always going to do is find the amplitude. Amplitude is always the A number, but it's always positive, so we throw absolute values on there. So amplitude is always given as a positive number, and it's always the number that's right in front there. And then we will figure out our period. Our period always starts at 2 pi, and then we will divide by whatever this B number is. Then we will find these important 4 points, and I'll show you how we do that here in just a second. All right, so let's start with this one. Move my camera a little bit here. We have y equals 4 sine x. Our amplitude is that number out front, so our amplitude is 4. If this were negative 4, our amplitude would still be 4. Amplitude is always a positive number. Since there's no number here, our period is just 2 pi. Okay, this is a sine graph. Sine graphs start at the origin 0, 0. Our period tells us where it ends. So it ends at 2 pi. So I'm going to label that one 2 pi. And a sine graph ends on the origin. Then we go halfway in between. Halfway between 0 and 2 pi is 1 pi. And that would be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That would be right here. And that's always on the origin, or on the axis also. And then finally, we go halfway in between again. Halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. But here, our sine wave is high. So I'm going to call, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll call that 4. So this is halfway in between. That's pi over 2. So we would have pi over 2, 4. There's our high point. And then finally, halfway between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. And this is where we're going to have our low point. And that'll be right there. The y value will be negative 4. Oops, you can't quite see that. There we go. And then we play a game of connect the dots with, nice smooth curve here. And that gives us our sine graph. Okay, for a cosine graph, the process is really the same. Almost. I'll show you where it's different. Amplitude is 2, because that's the number in front there. There's no number inside here, so period is 2 pi. Here's where the big difference is. Sine graph always starts on the axis. Cosine graph always starts high or low, depending on this number. When this number is positive, it starts high. So it's going to start there at the high point of 2. Period is 2 pi, so it's going to end at 2 pi, and it also ends high. So sine graph starts on the axis, ends on the axis. Cosine graph starts high or low. If this is positive, it's high, and ends high also, or ends low, depending if it started low. Okay, halfway between 0 and 2 pi is still 1 pi. And this is where we're going to have our low point. Negative 2. All right, so again, notice the difference. On your sine graph, your 2 endpoints and your middle point are all on the axis. For a cosine graph, your 2 endpoints and your middle points are all off the axis. The other 2 points are on the axis. Halfway between is pi over 2. So we got a dot there. And then halfway in between here is 3 pi over 2, so we have a dot there. And then we make a nice cosine graph, like so. Okay. Y equals negative 3 cosine x. Now our amplitude is 3. Again, amplitude is always given as a positive number. Period, there's still no number there, so my period is still 2 pi. Now, the big difference with this one, because this is a negative 3, our cosine graph is flipped over, so it starts low. Cosine usually starts high. This time it's going to start low. It ends at 2 pi, and again it will be low. Halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi, and it will be high there. 1, 2, 3. And then finally, the next 2 points are pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And that's where the cosine graph is on the axes. All right, nice smooth cosine graph. Like so. All right, so see the big difference there? What this negative 3 does, instead of the graph starting high, the graph starts low and ends low, and then it's high in the middle. All right, the negative 2 on the sine, amplitude is still 2. Amplitude is a positive number. And my period is still 2 pi because there's no number right there. Sine graph starts on the axis. So it starts at 0, 0. Ends on the axis at 2 pi. In the middle, at pi, it's on the axis. Here's where the negative comes into play. Normally, sine graph goes here and goes up and comes back down. Because of this negative, it's going to go down first and then back up. So halfway in between is pi over 2. It's going to be at the low point there. And then finally, halfway between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. It will be high there. So again, that's what the negative does. The negative just changes the location of the high spot and the low spot. And there's our sine graph. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit more complicated, because now not only are we going to change the amplitude is 4, we're also going to change the period. So the period always starts with a 2 pi, and then you divide by whatever that number is right there. The 2's reduce out, and you get pi. So what that's going to change, that's going to change all of these numbers. So I'd like to spread my graph out still, though. We're going to start at 0, 0. Sine always starts on the axis. And then, now I'm going to call this one pi. Before we called it 2 pi, I'm going to call it pi, and it's going to end there. Okay, what I like to do next is find the middle. What's halfway between 0 and pi? Halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And the sine graph hits the axis right there also. Then we got to go halfway in between. What's halfway between 0 and pi over 2? Halfway between 0 and pi over 2 is pi over 4. And this is where our sine graph will be high. Right there. And then this is the hardest one. What's halfway between pi over 2 and pi? Well, to figure that out, what you really have to do is take pi over 2 plus pi and then divide it by 2. But here's the easy way to do that on your calculator. If you type this in on your calculator, it's not going to give you a good answer because of that pi. The way to do it is to accept that there's going to be a pi in the answer. So ignore the pi at first. So I'm just going to go 1/2 instead of pi over 2 and 1 over 2 plus 1. It gives me 1.5. Then I'm going to divide by 2. And then I'm going to turn it into a fraction. So my answer is 3 pi over 4. So notice how I did that. I just left the pi out. Calculator will figure it out. And then I put the pi back in. So this one here is at 3 pi over 4. And that's where my low point is going to happen. Right there. And I get that graph. All right, let's keep going. -3 cosine 3x, cosine 4x. My amplitude is 3. Again, amplitude is always, always, always given as a positive number. Period always starts at 2 pi, and then you divide by whatever that number is. The 2 and the 4 reduce, you get pi over 2. So again, what this is going to do is it's going to change all of these x numbers. Cosine graph usually starts high, but because of this negative, it's going to start low. So it's going to start at -3, 0, -3. It's then going to end low. And it's going to end where the period ends, at pi over 2. Now, what's halfway between 0 and pi over 2? Again, if you're not comfortable with the fractions, you really can use your calculator. What I'm doing here is I'm doing 0 plus pi over 2 and then dividing by 2. But again, the calculator doesn't deal with the pi well, so don't use the pi. Just go 0 plus 1/2 and then divide by 2 and ask for a fraction. Calculator says 1/4, so that means it's pi over 4. So this is pi over 4, halfway in between, and that's where we're going to be high. Okay, halfway between 0 and pi over 4, well, you really just make, going halfway between 0 and something is easy. You just make the denominator twice as big. If you don't believe me, use your calculator. It really is pi over 8, and we hit the axis there. And then this last one, again, use your calculator, ignore the pi's. 1/4 plus 1/2, divide it by 2, and turn it into a fraction. 3/8. So this is 3/8 pi, 3 pi over 8, and we hit the axis right there. All right, so we draw our nice smooth cosine graph. So it's kind of misleading. If you look at these, it looks like this graph is exactly the same as that graph. I mean, if you look at the points, they're in the same place in the grid. The big difference is the x numbers are different. Notice the numbers here are pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, where the numbers here are pi over 8, pi over 4. If I were to draw these on the same axis, this one would look very, very squished compared to that one. The period is much shorter. The period here is 2 pi. Period here is 2 pi, where the period here is only pi over 2. So you might want to like open up Desmos and just show yourself that. Graph -3 cosine x and graph -3 cosine 4x, and you'll see that this one is squished this way. It has a much shorter period. Okay, we got a few more problems to do in this section, but I'm running out of time in my video, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll continue on with part 3.